In the heart of the Great Depression, a time of dust, despair, and desperation, two names echoed from the cities to the farmlands, whispered in speakeasies, and shouted in newsrooms. Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow. They weren't just criminals, they were a phenomenon. Their faces, plastered on wanted posters from Texas to Minnesota, became as recognizable as movie stars. But these weren't glamorous they were grainy, serious, and carried the weight of a federal manhunt. Yet, something happened that no one, least of all the authorities, expected. The public, beaten down by economic collapse, didn't just see outlaws. They saw something else entirely. Imagine picking up the morning paper. You're struggling to feed your family. The bank has foreclosed on your neighbor, and the future looks bleak. Then you see it, a story about Bonnie and Clyde. They'd robbed another bank, the very institution people blamed for their misery. They'd outsmarted the police again, making a mockery of the authorities who seemed powerless to help the common man. It was a thrill, a vicarious rebellion. For many, Bonnie and Clyde weren't villains. They were anti-heroes, striking back at a system that felt rigged and unfair. This sentiment was most potent among the youth, young men and women with no jobs and no prospects, saw a twisted kind of freedom in Bonnie and Clyde's life on the run. They weren't playing by the rules, because the rules seemed broken. Instead, they were creating their own. The newspapers, hungry for sensational stories, fanned the flames. They printed Bonnie's poems, like the story of Suicide Sal and the Trail's End. These weren't the ramblings of a hardened killer. They were a young woman's romantic, albeit dark, musings on love, life, and death. One particular set of photographs discovered after a police raid in Joplin, Missouri, cemented their legend. The images were candid, almost playful. There was Bonnie, foot up on the bumper of a Ford V8, a cigar clenched in her teeth, a pistol in her hand. There was Clyde, holding Bonnie, the two of them looking like any young couple in love, except for the arsenal of weapons they proudly displayed. These photos went viral. 1930s. They were reprinted in papers across the country, and they were Bonnie and Clyde weren't just robbing banks. They were living a life of high adventure, and they were documenting it. They were crafting their own myth, and America was eating it up. For the older generation, this was terrifying. Their children were looking up to bank robbers and murderers. The romanticism surrounding the Barrow gang was a symptom of a sick society, a breakdown of moral values. Parents saw the rebellious glint in their children's eyes and feared they were losing them to this new, dangerous culture of defiance. What did it say about the country when its youth idolized people who left a trail of dead police officers and innocent bystanders in their wake? The generation gap widened into a chasm, with Bonnie and Clyde standing right in the middle. And what of the couple at the center of this story? They were avid readers of their own press. They followed the stories, collected the clippings, and understood the power of their growing fame. Bonnie, in particular, seemed to embrace the role of the tragic, romantic Her poetry sent to newspapers was a deliberate act of public relations. She was telling her side of the story, shaping the narrative she knew they were doomed, writing, "Someday they'll go down together, and they'll bury them side by side. To a few it LL be grief to. Be grief to." Dest for Bonnie and Clyde. They weren't just running from the law. They were running with their own legend. They played the part, dressing stylishly when they could. Clyde favoring sharp suits and Bonnie favoring fashionable berets and dresses. They knew their image was as powerful as their guns. This myth-making became a kind of armor. If the public loved them, maybe they'd be more willing to offer a safe house, a meal, or a tip about a police roadblock. Their fame was both a beacon for law enforcement and a shield against it. But the reality of their lives was anything but glamorous. It was a desperate, nomadic existence, living out of a car, always looking over their shoulder. They were constantly on the move, driving hundreds of miles a day on back roads, sleeping in shifts. Injuries festered without proper medical care. Clyde was hobbled, having chopped off 2 of his own toes in prison years earlier. Bonnie was severely burned in a car accident, and Clyde had to carry her everywhere for a time. They were in constant pain, paranoia their only companion. As the law closed in, their plans grew more audacious, more desperate. The myth they had helped create was now a cage. They were too famous to simply disappear. There was no blending in. Every gas station attendant, every diner waitress, every small-town sheriff was looking for them. Their world shrank to the confines of Tamandafuta Vibachicha. Their final, desperate plan wasn't just about another robbery. It was about escape, not just from a posse of Lamen, but from the entire country. They dreamed of getting out of America, of finding a place where their names Bonnie and Clyde meant nothing, where they could live out their lives in peace. They spoke of buying a small gas station or a cafe in Mexico or South America. It was a fantasy, a stark contrast to the bloody reality of their lives. But it was this dream that kept them going, driving through another night, one step ahead of the law. The Baro gang's crimes were getting more violent, the police response more organized and ruthless. The net was tightening, led by the determined former Texas Ranger, Frank Hammer. A special posse was formed with one mission: to stop Bonnie and Clyde by any means necessary. Hammer wasn't interested in their press clippings or Bonnie's poetry. He was a stone-cold manhunter, and he studied their movements, their habits, their roots. He knew they were creatures of habit, often circling back to visit family in Texas. This predictability would be their undoing. Hammer and his men knew the gang was due to rendezvous with one of their members' family. They set up an ambush on a quiet rural road in Boonville Parish, Louisiana. They didn't shout a warning. They didn't ask them to surrender. When the Ford V8 carrying Bonnie and Clyde came into view on the morning of May 23rd, 1934, the officers opened fire. It was a deafening, relentless barrage. Over 130 rounds were fired into the car. The myth died in an instant, replaced by the brutal, bloody reality. The aftermath was a spectacle. News of their deaths spread like wildfire, and crowds flocked to the scene, eager for a macabre souvenir, a piece of their clothing, a shell casing, even a lock of their head. The public that had romanticized them in life was now clamoring to witness their violent end. Their bodies were put on public display, and thousands lined up to see the bullet-riddled remains of the infamous lovers. In the end, Barney's poetic prophecy came true. They went down together, but they weren't buried side by side as she had wished. Her family wouldn't allow it. Their story, however, was sealed. A tragic, violent, and strangely romantic chapter in American history. A story of two kids from the Dallas slums who, for a brief, blazing moment, captured the nation's attention. Their hearts forever imprinted on those wanted posters. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this journey into the past, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more stories from history's most fascinating chapters.